I'm 87 years old and looking forward to many more years, uh, hopefully of good luck and better health. Um, I think I'm going to start this out with a little family history uh, because I think the family histories are significant to all of us. My mother's family was in Virginia in 1800 and migrated west through the Cumberland Gap and ended up in northeastern Missouri, an Independence area. I say my great-great-grandparents sold oxen to the migrants to Oregon, but that's my fiction. She, as a youngster during the First World War, drove to Tampa in Florida for the winters. I don't know what kind of car her father had, but I think that is interesting. She was adventurous enough to do that. Her parents had both died by the time she was by 1927, and she went off to college and then joined she had two younger brothers who died and three older sisters who lived, and she joined one of the older sisters and went to the University of Nebraska. My grandfather's family came over from Ireland right after the Civil War to Oil City. They did very well, but the oils ran dry because they didn't know to drill them deeper, and they left with nothing and went to North Platte, Nebraska, in the middle of the plains of the country. I think they had family there. Sometime in the probably the early 1880s, the Catholic priest came to them and said, the McNamara children have got to go to the Catholic Church, and my grandfather said no. The public school is better. My grandfather's four older sisters went off to the Episcopal Church. I say because the better men were there, and my grandfather and his parents went to the Methodist Church, and they and my father were staunch Methodists all their life. And my wife's family had a similar story. They were in Iowa, and the family had hard times in the farming depression of the 20s, which we don't talk about much, but that was because the farms had grown to feed Europe. They had sold farm products to Europe starting in the late 1890s, and that was big business. And that was all gone. So the depression started for the farmers in the early 20s. Okay. Are people hearing? Okay. So anyway, as a child, I was born in 1933. I ended up traveling a lot because my father went into the Army a year before Pearl Harbor. He had joined the reserves. And I remember it must have been as a 4-year-old, traveling on the Streamliner, from Denver, Colorado to North Platte, Nebraska. Now, I wasn't scared. A child wouldn't travel like that now, but there was a nurse on the train, and I suspect my grandfather had it all wired with the conductor anyway. But I, of course, didn't know that at that age. But anyway, from then on, I ended up having to do a lot of traveling because we moved from Denver to Maryland. And I remember when I first got to Maryland, we lived out on a dairy farm. And I remember playing around the cows and in the silo and all as it was second grade, and walking down to the country store where I caught a school bus into Bel Air, Maryland, the biggest little city around. I went to the rest of second grade, and then that summer we moved to Des Moines, Iowa, where my father had he had colored troops and had lots of trouble with them because the Southern colored or black boys would be fleeced by the New York City ones, and he was always having disciplinary problems. And this innocent Midwestern boy had to deal, now man, of course, had to deal with that as the company officer. So he lobbied we traveled a lot, visited New York City and the ocean and all. And then in the summer, we moved to Des Moines. Again, I went to third grade in Des Moines. Then we moved to Milwaukee, and I went to fourth and fifth grade in Milwaukee. And now where my father was responsible for an ordnance plant. And then we moved back to Denver. And I did my early teenage years in Denver. And then just before ninth grade, the summer of ninth grade, we moved to Boise, Idaho. And I had a very interesting high school career. I was editor of the yearbook and had a lot of friends. Now, in 1950, when we applied for college, the GI Bill was, people had finished college for the most part. So you just applied for a college and you were sure of getting in. And I applied to a number of them, except I knew I didn't want to go to California because I figured if I went to California to school for engineering, I'd be there for war work, and I didn't want to do that. So I went to the Iowa State University at Ames. I got on the train at 9 o'clock at night and got off of it again at 9 o'clock the next night. I went, and I didn't even have a place to live there. I decided to go so late in the summer. Somehow I joined a fraternity and had a good life in college. Before I'd left Idaho, I had seen an ad in the paper. Are you a Unitarian? And not knowing it. And I read it and I said, I've been rebellious in the Methodist Church for years. This looks interesting. So my freshman year, I went to the Unitarian Fellowship and essentially joined my freshman year of college. The beginning of my sophomore year, the church groups had a meeting in the student union. And I remember going to this meeting, and across the room, I saw this girl traipse into our meeting, and I said, interesting. I followed up on it and chased her for 3 years, and she married me. And we had a good life together. I remember visiting her family for the first time in Des Moines. She had 3 twins. And her father was on campus at the time getting his PhD. I knew I could never satisfy her father. First she was the eldest daughter, and second, I wasn't a PhD status. So I knew I had to win over her three sisters and her mother first. And I worked at that hard. I guess evidently I did, because she did agree to marry me several years later. And we were married the spring of our senior year. I remember we went off to work in Chicago for the summer, and we did go to the Unitarian Church there at the University of Chicago campus. The first place we lived after graduation, I had a job with General Electric, and we moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana, for my first year of training with General Electric. I found out later that my parents were very upset with us because we didn't come and visit them for Christmas. Well, I wasn't willing to tell them we couldn't go to them because we didn't have enough money to get there. We could only get to Fort Wayne, Indiana. So we started off working there, and then I went into the service. And at the end of 6 months in the service, the war in Korea was going down, and they didn't want us, and so I got released. And I was in the reserves regularly. And then, after several assignments with General Electric around the Northeast, we ended up in Utica. I had a permanent job there at the radio receiver plant. That job lasted several years, and we were very active in the Fort Wayne church. I think I was even, we were active in the Utica church. And I think I was on the board, and we hired one of the early ministers, Greta Crosby. She had graduated from the Chicago Seminary and was working in the bookstore, and was one of the early Unitarian ministers. She was a superb minister. I think she had a law degree, and all the engineers in the Utica church liked her because of her sermons were so sharp and clear. Then what did this woman do? But she up and got married and followed her husband away. Then GE was getting to move me again. And so I said, well, this is time to look for a more permanent job than a move every 2 years. And I decided to work for a little company called Haloid Xerox. And we moved in January of '61 from Utica to Rochester. And by that time, we had a son. So the three of us moved. And we moved, I had looked at a map of Rochester and said, the nice places to live must be around this bay. And so we lived in East Irondequoit. And I went to work in the Webster Engineering Campus was 6 months old, and I went to work there. We were very active. My wife was, I think, president of the PTA. And Amelia Nugent was trying to lower our taxes. And anyway, her efforts to lower our taxes destroyed the school system in 6 years. I reduced its quality in 6 or 7 years. So my wife said, look, this school isn't enough for our children. So I said, okay, find us another place to live, and went back to work. She went out, found us a nice home in Pittsford, and we moved to Pittsford in about 1965. Now, when we came to Rochester, of course, the first place we went to the Unitarian Church. They were meeting in the Dryden Theater. And we went to everything that was going on. The minister was new there. It was Ann Perry's father. The old minister sat down in the front row and took notes and criticized his sermon to the rest of the congregation afterwards in coffee hour. And it wasn't a good situation. And our son didn't like the Sunday school over in Dryden House. So we went down to the Universalist Church downtown. Dick Fitz greeted us with open arms like he had known us forever. Well, evidently our Utica friends had talked to him about, look for the McNamaras. And we became staunch members of the downtown church. Carl Westman was the minister, and he was a superb minister. We did a lot of planning and hoping to grow the downtown church. Fortunately, we didn't get to do everything we wanted to do because I think we would have ruined the architectural integrity of the church accomplishing them. That church had been scheduled to be demolished because it sat out in the middle of Court Street. If you look from Washington Square east, you'll see it sits out in Court Street, and they were going to demolish it at one time. So they hadn't done anything to upgrade it. So anyway, that went on for quite a while. John Shala, my wife was in the committee to call the minister, and we called a minister named John Shala, who was an ex-monk. Well, that proved to be a real fiasco. He carried the baby Jesus around at Christmas and prayed a lot and was very Christian and was not friendly to a number of us. So I remember the end, during this whole period, we had done a number of things with the Unitarian Church, and we're very friendly with Dick Gilbert and company. And we were always accepted at the Unitarian Church. I remember we did About Your the old equivalent of About Your Sexuality when it was right for our children. We did an adult session of that while other people taught our children and theirs. The adult section with which the UUA was trying out, the group decided it was too raw for Unitarians then. I'm sure it would be considered tame today if I looked at it. But then it was too raw, and it was never done again. So, and we also helped arrange jointly between the church summer services upstairs in the Gilbert room regularly for half a dozen or a dozen services. And we participated in the Universalist State Convention as well as the New York State Convention, the Unitarian Convention that included Upper New York State, Ontario, and Montreal and Quebec. And so my wife was very active in that, and she ended up as on the summer camp board the year that the cabin burned down, the main cabin burned down, and the board quickly elected her president. I think she was innocent of everything. Anyway, her job was to really get the cabin, cabin rebuilt. And with the help of an architect from our church, and half a dozen other people from a lot of Schenectady people and other people from our church. They raised enough money to rebuild the cabin. And when she retired, the cabin was the meeting hall was turned over to them, and it's the main meeting hall now. I'm sure any of you have been to up to the camp have been in it. From then on, she went on to be elected by the district to be the UUA on the UUA Board of Trustees. And she served 8 years on the Board of Trustees up to about 1992. And we went to General Assembly just about every year. We had done that before she was elected, and we did it afterwards. That was part of our normal summer vacation. The year she retired from that board is the year that she had her heart transplant. We later learned that she had a family gene that was really responsible for her heart problems. Anyway, she had a heart transplant at Cleveland Clinic that year, and that heart transplant proved very successful. We traveled a lot after that, and she took a lot of medicine, and we went to Cleveland regularly for exams and all. But it was most successful for well over 20 years. When it came time to retire, and I had left Xerox in the about 1980, and she was working for Dick Gilbert at the church at the time, and I worked on a computer system that a group had bought for the church to replace the old addressograph machine. And we used an Apple IIe and a printer to print the mailing list. And that was a big deal and quite a learning experience. From that, I met a man who was head of the family court and putting in a similar system in the family court system. And I volunteered to go in and help him do this in the courts. Well, in the early 80s, the courts had no way to help take volunteers, and people just didn't do that. Well, they put me on the payroll, and I worked for the courts putting in computer systems in upstate New York for the next 20 years. Finally, in the early, in 2000, I was almost 70, and it was time to retire. And the judges were getting laptops, and they weren't as appreciative of our work as the women in the offices were, because we helped them with typing, and they appreciated our help. And it was a pleasure to work with them and the court managers all the time. But the judges were pretty demanding. They'd take their laptop computers home, and the kids would mess them up. And you didn't tell a judge that his kids had messed up his computer, and that's why he was having trouble. And while I was quiet, I was not internally that patient with them. And it was really time to retire. My father had moved. My mother had died, and my father had remarried, and he had moved to Florida. His wife did not like my brothers and my wife, so they didn't go to Florida with us. But we went to Florida several times a year to visit them. When he died, we were responsible for his wife, and she was not really that well. We tried to keep her at home, but we did that for a week, and we realized we couldn't manage 24-hour home health care. And we found a reasonable home for her, and she moved in there, and we moved a great big television set, projection television set, to her new quarters. Well, she seemed to be happy there, but she never even turned on the television set that we'd worried about. Anyway, she turned out to be very appreciative of what we did for her and very cooperative, which was very nice, because in the end, when she died, I got credit from my daughters for our good help of her. And that was probably more reward than anybody else could have given us. And the reason that's important, because both my brother and I knew that we were not going to retire to Florida. We knew from that experience that that was not a good idea. So we sold his house before the first hurricane and have never gone back. When it came time to retire, I began looking at places, and I talked with Sandy and Jack Maniloff. I had some cancer, and I remember Jack Maniloff gave me a ride into my X-ray treatments every morning. He was going by essentially near my house, and he came by and picked me up and gave me a ride into my cancer treatments. Then my wife later came and picked me up. And I can't remember all that help. Well, I turned to Jack again. What are we going to? I knew what had happened to them. They lived in the Renaissance a year after they bought their place, their retirement home. I knew I wasn't going to get in that situation. But anyway, I went to see where they were living, and they were very happy with it. But Jack introduced me to a group called Grandma's Helpers. We used the Grandma's Helpers to move us from our second floor bedroom down to a bedroom in the family room in the first floor. And that introduced us to Grandma's Helpers. We later realized, I realized we had to get out of our house, particularly when I couldn't get down and get the water heater relighted or change the filters in the furnace like I had and do the work around the house. So again, we followed Jack's advice and got Grandma's Helpers, and they would come. And my wife wouldn't throw away anything. So I remembered to have Grandma's Helpers come in the morning, and I would come off. Oh, and we decided we were going to move to Valley Manor because we wanted to be near church, and because our church community was so important to us. And our children lived by that time in Boston and Erie, Pennsylvania. So we were right in the middle. That has proved to be a good choice because they seem to come and check up on me every 3 months, which I appreciate a lot. Anyway, Grandma's Helpers helped my wife throw away a lot of stuff that should have been thrown away long ago. My children came and helped me move everything out of the attic of the garage and the attic of the house. And her brother-in-law came, and we had gotten two small apartments in Valley Manor on the 8th floor. And Valley Manor wanted to combine them in one, and that gave space enough for the two of us. And we designed this apartment to meet all our needs. A shower in the bedroom that was big enough for a wheelchair to go into, and a kitchen we could serve the family from. The kitchen only gets used by my daughter-in-laws, and the dishwasher gets used every 2 weeks. But still, I've elected to stay in it because it's convenient. All her Unitarian Universalist books went to the church, to the ministers. I tried to give them to Dick Gilbert, and I think Gilbert said, I'll shoot you for bringing another book into this house. Or no, Joyce will shoot you if you bring another book into this house. And so after he turned them down, I donated to them the bookshop at the Unitarian Church with the idea that the church books, the religious books, go to the ministers. And Sherry was just coming in then, and so they were left for her. Fortunately, she didn't have a big library at that time, and to the new minister, and any she didn't want were to go downtown to the Unitarian Universalist Church. So my wife died a year and a half ago. I think it's more from the autoimmune, immune suppression problems from having to do that for the heart transplant. But we had 24 years of good life with that heart transplant, and it was worth all of it. So now I'm elected to stay, and I'm very happy with my decision to stay in Rochester. So I kept my church communities and my friends' communities here. And Valley Manor's been a good decision for us. And that's a brief over history of